you to our session entitled Over the Hedge, Southeast Asia in a Multipolar World. Our panel will examine opportunities for and challenges to ASEAN in a multipolar world, Southeast Asia's economic precarity under weakening global trade rules, and the shifting views of Asian capitals towards the rules-based order. The panel will also assess the extent to which the bloc's hedging and multi-alignment are sustainable strategies and how its external partners can best engage. So I'd like to introduce the panelists with us today. We have 3 on stage and 1 online. So going immediately to my left, to the right of me, Professor Amitav Acharya holds the chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance at American University's School of International Service and has been described as one of the great academic ASEAnists. Professor Kai Ostwald is the director of the Institute for Asian Research at the University of British Columbia and one of Canada's leading lights in terms of linking the academic and policy communities on engagement in Southeast Asia and with Southeast Asia. Professor Jennifer Mustapha teaches political science at Huron University at Western University, and she is an expert on Southeast Asian regional security politics. She's also a member of the Defense and Security Foresight Group at the University of Waterloo. And online, we have Dr. Alexander Vuving, who's professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, a U.S. Department of Defense institute in Hawaii. His expertise spans great power competition, China, Vietnam, and the South China Sea. So for today's panel, we have a group question for each of the panelists, the same question for all of them, and then there will be individual questions. And for the third round of questions, it's going to be a very short firing line, because I hope to leave some time for questions and answers. So starting off with the general question, I'd like your quick thoughts on how Southeast Asia is adjusting to a world where major powers are simultaneously competing, cooperating, and contesting norms. In the context of this multipolar flux, how is ASEAN re-evaluating its role as a convener, buffer, and standard setter? And what does this mean for Canada's engagement in Southeast Asia? So perhaps, Amitav, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, High Commissioner Bentley. It's great to be here. So, High Commissioner Bentley mentioned I'm one of the great academic ASEAnists. You know, the term is not flattering, by the way. 1990s, when I first started writing on ASEAN, some of the critiques of my work said, this is like a ASEAN version of Sovietology, right? So I became the ASEAnist. However, the big difference is the Soviet Union is gone and ASEAN is still here, and it will never go. So that's my understanding of ASEAN. So I wear it as a badge of honor. On your question about multipolarity, I don't buy multipolarity, just like I don't buy Indo-Pacific, but that's a different question. The reason why I don't buy multipolarity is because multipolarity is kind of self-injurious to countries like Canada, because you're not a power, it's not a pole. So you will be objects and subjects. And that's an old-fashioned 19th century, early 20th century term to describe great powers. The main actors are great powers. Middle powers like Canada, Malaysia don't have a role. They are basically pushed around, like Poland before World War II. So I have used the term multiplex rather than multipolar, where you take into account more actors, not just great powers, but also regional powers, middle powers, non-state actors. And I believe they play a very important role in shaping world order, not just distribution of power. From that point of view, I believe that what ASEAN is facing, I mean, everything seems new, but ASEAN has always faced great power rivalry. ASEAN was created at a time when great power rivalry, this is not just the US and the Soviet Union, but China was a third country as well. And ASEAN was a way to manage great power rivalry then as it is now. Of course, the world is a bit different. I've got a new book from Southeast Asia to Indo-Pacific that describes the process of ASEAN managing old great power rivalry and the new great power rivalry. So I think the main thing for ASEAN is how do you manage this rivalry, playing both sides, okay? I think what ASEAN is trying is what I call multi-alignment, multi-engagement. And this is why I want to go back to most recent development when President Trump visited Southeast Asia, was hailed as a major success, but ASEAN is not, and I repeat, not going to choose sides. Malaysia, it was President Trump went there because he wanted to sign a peace deal between Cambodia and Thailand. He has no interest in ASEAN. But he knows more about ASEAN than his defense secretary, who actually said Japan and South Korea are members of ASEAN. And it's a confirmation hearing. But I think it's, despite all the coercive pressure, Southeast Asians are pragmatic. They adjusted to Trump's demands, but they are not going to give up relations with China and obey what the Americans told them to do so. And it was a success for Malaysian Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim more than anything else. But Indonesians managed the G20 a couple of years ago successfully. ASEAN knows how to play this game. I have every confidence that it will continue to do so.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Amitav, and you came in under time, so well done. Kai, your turn.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Amitav. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with us, despite possibly not having seen the sun in quite a few hours now. So I'm going to follow on with a number of points that Amitav made, and I'll make two observations and draw out one implication from that. As a first observation, I like the term we heard earlier, pragmatic scramble. I think that describes the way that many actors around the world are viewing changes, and that's certainly true for Southeast Asia as well. There are interpretations of how Southeast Asia is reacting to pragmatic scramble that suggest fragmentation of the region, and we can certainly find indicators that look like fragmentation. The Economist published a piece with survey results asking 30,000 or so respondents, who do they feel more comfortable with as leader of the world, China or the United States? Indonesia, the largest country of Southeast Asia, only about 25% indicated the United States, about 2/3 China. The Philippines, the second largest by population, was almost the polar opposite. So we can look for and find ways in which the region appears to be diverging. But I think the really important observation, much like great power competition has always been a part of ASEAN's reality, is that that kind of diversity has also always been a part of ASEAN's reality. That's not new. And it's not necessarily a response to the pragmatic scramble, even if the pragmatic scramble is adding pressure here and there. So as a second observation, what I'd like to say is that despite the appearance of lots of change, and some actual change, the fundamental preferences for most Southeast Asian actors are unchanged. And I don't want to speak for Southeast Asia. We have the High Commissioner of Malaysia here who is much better positioned to do that, but I'll speak as an observer of Southeast Asia, which is that when asked, most countries of Southeast Asia would immediately say their preferences are for stability, both security, economic, trade. Their preference is to retain agency, which means also not being forced into a binary decision on which of the emerging powers or great powers to side with on important issues. Their preference, when we think rules-based order, is primarily around sovereignty, protection of sovereignty and protection of that agency. Right? And that's precisely what makes for a lot of anxiety in parts of the region when we hear the emerging geopolitical tension framed as a new Cold War. Because Cold War suggests not just bipolar order, but also a strong ideological component to it. And I think that's another area where there is a strong preference to skew towards pragmatic solutions rather than be shoehorned into ideological pigeonholes. So what is the implication of this, briefly? I think it doesn't take a lot of looking to identify new linkages being formed by member states of ASEAN. New minilaterals emerging, issue-based in many instances, flexible, more time flexible as well, not necessarily intended to be lasting over the long run. These are sometimes positioned or described as though they were in competition with ASEAN, which I don't think is the case. These exist alongside ASEAN, and maybe they present a challenge to ASEAN centrality insofar as one element of ASEAN centrality is that ASEAN as an organization, as an association, is tended to be the first place to turn to. But ASEAN has an immense gravity that is not going to go away, and ASEAN, as a result, is going to weather this storm as well, even if it is now supplemented increasingly by pragmatic, flexible, minilateral arrangements.
Thank you very much for your succinct response to that question, Kai. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm following a great mind and a leading light, so the pressure is off. We have our disagreements, but I think Amitav, Kai, and I are quite aligned on a lot of what we're saying on this panel. So I'm not saying a lot of anything particularly new or groundbreaking. ASEAN was built for uncertainty, for unpredictability. This is not new. This is, ASEAN's been preparing its whole life for this. Both individual actors and members within ASEAN, but also as a region, right? ASEAN, what it is known for, and also what it is criticized for, depending on where you're coming from, is, that its members tend to be nimble and flexible and pragmatic above all else. Again, both as individual members, but also as a region. I think this concept of great power dynamics being very uncertain at the moment. Certainly there seems to be a bit more uncertainty and unpredictability than usual, including internally. So, the recent issues with, for example, Cambodia and Thailand are very concerning to the region. But I tend to align with my colleagues' perspectives that, on balance, this is nothing particularly novel. With regards to the sort of great power dynamics, again, I think there is a tendency to kind of, especially from the Western perspective, there's a tendency, I think, to overestimate the meaning of relationships with China. And I think there's a tendency to underestimate the continued importance of that strategic and political and trade relationships with the U.S. as well. So, I think I always urge, my fellow practitioners and academics to be neither paranoid nor cavalier about those dynamics in the region. And I think we kind of have a tendency to do this as Western scholars of ASEAN, or of the region in general, to kind of underestimate this. And, the thing is that ASEAN and ASEAN members know this already, and they also know this about us. So that kind of brings me to, I think, another point at play here, which is that I continue to be struck by the disconnect in self-perception by American policymakers, Canadians as well, of their role and how they are perceived in the region, with how they are actually perceived in the region and what their role actually is. And I think this disconnect is actually the source of a lot of the uncertainty at the moment. So suddenly there's a bit of concern about, does this administration know what it's doing in the region more than before, if I may? And I think that this is one of the things that kind of continues to animate those dynamics. The Trump visit, on balance, I think was seen as overwhelmingly reassuring for now. But it remains to be seen. And I think, there's something to pick up on with the multiplex approach, which is that, there continues to be a variety of ways that ASEAN and its members interact with the rest of the world. And this happens across many tracks and in many different fora, and that will continue to be the case. So it's, ASEAN is ASEAN, and ASEAN will keep ASEANing, and I don't think that it is more or less necessarily than what we tend to make of it. And yeah, I don't think we should either overestimate or underestimate some of these dynamics. But in particular, to not trend into like a paranoid concern with some relationships or a cavalier concern with others. That's a very academic, waffly response, but we like to say everything is complicated. So I'll just leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And now we will invite our virtual panelist, Alexander Vuving, to share his comments with us.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
He may be not able to hear us. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to join your forum remotely. And before I say anything, I have to make the disclaimer that anything that I say here is my own opinion and doesn't reflect the view of my employer. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think the question is about ASEAN's response to the new reality, and I don't think that there is a single or common ASEAN response, as our previous panelist has emphasized. ASEAN is characterized by great diversity, and so I am seeing diverse responses ASEAN to the new reality. And each country, I think, perceive the new reality in a different way. Some, may polar, some may see as multiplex, and some may see it differently. And from the ASEAN countries to the new reality, I think, but the ASEAN capability and role in world politics, which I think they want to be a buffer and they want to be a standard setter. Now, the thing is, how do they sort of balance between these different roles in the new reality? And I think that we are living in a new era of great power competition, which is very different from the last 3 decades of the post-Cold War era. It's also different from the Cold War, as some of our Kai, for example, I think mentioned. There will be no. It's a little bipolar in the Indo-Pacific region, with China and the United States being the sort of a new superpowers. But at the same time, globally, we also have the EU. And also within the region, we have many other major powers which are keen to act independently and to preserve their autonomy. And within ASEAN, probably you don't. It's hard to hear me, right? Okay. I don't know how to make the volume better. I don't know. So just, okay, anyway. So I was talking about ASEAN's diversity, and I think that the ASEAN countries are, each ASEAN country would value several things. Not just security, but also prosperity and also autonomy. And so they have to make a lot of trade-offs when it comes to their foreign policy, when it comes to their relationship with the U.S., with China, and with their sort of contribution to ASEAN. And so, but I think ASEAN has a strong preference to be a standard setter, to maintain the rules-based order, and also to be sort of the master of the rules of the game in the region. However, it's it is also a group of very small countries in between great power, and particularly with the heightened great power competition, where the great powers are trying to change the norms and the rules and the key arrangements in the international order in to their favor. And so, what can ASEAN play in this situation? I think is that ASEAN will individual countries in ASEAN must nimbly join forces with the like-minded countries with regard to specific norms or rules. So it's hard to talk about international order as a whole, or the set of rules and norms as a whole, because each specific rules or norms would be favorable to some countries, and those countries will try to promote those rules and norms. So particularly, for example, in the South China Sea, for example, some countries in ASEAN, not all, just some countries, particularly countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, and to some extent also Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, favor the UNCLOS, the sort of what we call the rules-based order. But in effect, it's the vision of open sea in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is an open sea, while China is pushing for the vision of South China Sea as a closed sea, where external countries do not have any say, and China is pushing, this opposite vision of the South of how to shape the rules in the South China Sea. And so I think some countries in ASEAN are joining forces with countries outside of ASEAN, for example, the US and Canada and Japan and India and the EU and the UK, to kind of maintain this rules-based order based on UNCLOS in the South China Sea. But then when it comes to, commercial rules, some other rules, then we will have a very different set of like-minded groupings. And so the ASEAN countries, individual countries, will flexibly change their alignment. And so what we have is going to be, sort of the hedging that most countries in ASEAN are hedging, but each country is hedging in a different way. So for example, we see Indonesia has joined BRICS as a member. And then we have countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam have become, BRICS partners, not members. But these are sort of examples of how individual countries in ASEAN are trying to maneuver to hedge within this the new reality. Another thing I think we need to emphasize is that ASEAN is not just diverse, but it's also very vulnerable to divide and rule strategy from the outside. ASEAN has historically been great when it is supported by at least one great power, particularly either the United States or China. Now, China and the U.S. are in a collision course, and so there is a big pressure to ASEAN countries to take sides in this competition. And of course, ASEAN, none of the ASEAN countries want to take sides. However, some countries, because of their own interests, because of they have to make their own balance, their own trade-offs between their major interests in security, in prosperity, and autonomy, and they would lean more toward either China or the U.S. And we have examples like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, and so on. And so ASEAN again is very vulnerable to the divide and rule strategy from the outside, and particularly China, I think, has a great interest in dividing ASEAN. And so, how does ASEAN sort of navigate this water? We don't know. It all depends a lot on the diplomatic skills of the ASEAN country, the ASEAN leaders, but also in creativity and flexibility and pragmatism. So
Alexander, may I interrupt and use some of my diplomatic flexibility here to say thank you very much for your very stimulating thoughts. I hope you can hold it there until the next round, where we do have a particular question for each of the panelists. So I'd now like to move into the second round, and each of the panelists will again have 4 minutes to speak. And we'll start with a question for Amitav. In your recent book, The Once and Future World Order, you argue that the emerging global order will be more pluralistic, decentralized, and driven by regional norms and history, rather than Western frameworks. How do these insights apply to ASEAN today, and what does ASEAN's approach to order building tell us about the kinds of global order that may be taking shape?
So what do I become now, world orderologist? Because I think there's a link between the way I look at ASEAN and I look at the world order. The new book called Once and Future World Order is a 5,000 years of history of world order, from Sumerians, Egyptians to present. And one of the insights of the book is that no world order is truly global. They're all regional. And so many of like the Roman Empire was a world order. We call it Chinese world order. The Han Dynasty was not a global empire. It was a regional empire. So all world order regions. So regions play a very important role in world order building. There are building blocks, stepping stones to world order, and which is why also there will be variations among different regions. Since this is really about, I have already said multipolarity and multiplexity. Multiplexity is about a pluralistic, decentralized world order. There is no hegemon or a bunch of great powers ruling the world. There will be all kinds of other actors, including regional powers, regional institutions, but also middle powers and the like. Now, one point, this is a meeting about the Indo-Pacific, right? And I have spent a lifetime studying how regions are created, managed, and how they perish. Just as Don Emerson, we all know Don Emerson from now at Stanford, one of the great Southeast Asianists, if not ASEANist. He said that nations come and go, why not regions? And that's what I found in my study of Asia and also the world. So as I explain in this book, the term of what is this region where Southeast Asia is located has gone through many, many transformations. In the 1950s, Southeast Asia included India, Pakistan, and Ceylon, Myanmar, Burma, and Indonesia. The Bandung Conference was convened by the Conference of Southeast Asian Prime Ministers, and India was part of it. But now nobody includes India in Southeast Asia or Pakistan or Ceylon. The term Far East that originally included Southeast Asia today was coined by imperialists like Portuguese and the British. And when the Far East the Economic and Social Commission of Asia Pacific was first created, it was called Economic and Social Commission of the Far East. And Thanat Koman, one of the founders of ASEAN, asked in the meeting, far from where? East of what? So they changed the name very quickly to Asia Pacific. Now, so then we have Asia, which was coined by nationalists, Nehru, Sukarno, and Aung San, and UNU, and others. That's the nationalist term, decolonization, post-colonial states creating Pan-Asianism. China and Japan were part of it. Then we have Asia Pacific. That was coined mainly by the economists. So Australians, Canadians, Japanese, Americans, and Southeast Asians. Then we move to East Asia. That is a culturalist term. So Mahathir, of course, was the leading advocate of East Asian Economic Caucus, East Asia minus the Caucasians, and saying that Asia Pacific, we don't trust, we cannot really think of Australia and the U.S. as part of the regions. So, and the South Koreans picked it up in a more inclusive way, but that was kind of a culturalist term. Indo-Pacific is coined and managed by strategists. Many of you might know that the term Indo-Pacific actually was first written about. Prime Minister Abe gave a speech in New Delhi where he talked about the joining of two oceans. But it was an Indian Navy captain, Gurpreet Khurana, who wrote the first article on Indo-Pacific. And it has been picked up by Australians, strategists, mostly strategists. And Yun Pao, Senator Pao in the morning is a good friend of mine for decades, so I call him his last name, Pao. He said, problems with Indo-Pacific. No identity, no institutions. There are other problems. I mean, those are important. There is no identity, regional identity like Asia have. And secondly, it's a strategic construction. It has very little, in economic component so far. And there is APEC and other kinds of regional constructions. But another problem with Indo-Pacific to me is that, and I have to consult my notes here, that it is in some ways, I'm
Over time.
yeah. I'm finishing. I took actually 2 out of 4 minutes in the morning. I'm the first lesson. The main thing is that it is the current U.S. administration. And just to give you one example, just a few days after Mr. Trump left Southeast Asia, just a couple of days ago, Singapore's senior leader, Lee Hsien Loong, former prime minister, gave a speech in Chatham House. And he said, most Asian countries do not see China as a threat. Now, this is Singapore, one of the biggest allies of the United States. And they can say all these things when the U.S. president visits. But my earlier point is that if Indo-Pacific is constructed in a way to exclude China, it's not going to work. And it is constructed the way the Indonesians want and the ASEAN outlook wants, with including more inclusive, pluralistic, it will work. And I think Canada should work for this later conception and not the earlier conception.
Great, plenty of food for thought from that answer. Thank you very much, Amitav. Kai, your turn.
And no question, too. This is great. I get to speak about anything I'd like.
ASEAN governments increasingly emphasize multi-alignment. How are Southeast Asian governments cultivating partnerships with middle powers like Canada to preserve that strategic space?
Thanks.
And what forms of external engagement are most compatible with the desire of ASEAN states to avoid being pressured into choosing sides?
So I'll answer that question by following on some of Amitav's points and maybe trying to speak pragmatically. I'll start by saying I think we all recognize that nuance is important when we look south of the border to the U.S., right? The Democratic Party is not the Republican Party. California is not Idaho, is not whatever else. GE is not Facebook, right? We forget about that nuance sometimes when we look across the Pacific. Southeast Asia is far away. It's hard to get farther away from Ottawa than Southeast Asia. But that nuance is just as important, if not even more important practically. Because I think what we find is that there are many opportunities that run counter to the narratives that we're bombarded with. Right? One of the main narratives of the last year is that Malaysia is moving towards China's camp. Or a little bit more alarmist, Malaysia has been lost to China. And yet we get an ASEAN summit where there were positive discussions between the United States and Malaysia and an agreement that may be a touch controversial, but that many saw as a positive step forward. Right? Certainly in contradiction to the dominant narrative on Malaysia's movement. I think we also have a tendency to dismiss Southeast Asia as indifferent to things that matter in Canada. But there are a lot of communities, countries, companies in Southeast Asia that do care about and are sensitive to impact on environment or impact on community or impact on labor conditions and the like. And I think where is Canada looking to engage, or where does it have an opportunity to engage? Partly it's by considering where some of Canada's strengths align with some of those needs. Canada may not be the cheapest bidder, but I don't think we can assume that counterparts in Southeast Asia are always looking for the cheapest bidder on collaboration. And beyond that, much of the talk that we've heard with trade has focused on commodities. And of course, commodities are an important part of Canada's economy. They're an important part of many economies in Southeast Asia. But I think there's also a real appetite in the region to move beyond commodities with economic engagement, to all manner of collaborative endeavors in areas like cyber, where some of the frameworks that Canada has built would be a good fit in Southeast Asia, or even something as simple as critical minerals. Right? There is a lot of capacity in China to help Southeast Asia develop its critical minerals, and a lot of concern in Southeast Asia about the costs of partnering with China on that. There are opportunities in Canada for all of this, even if we aren't the cheapest bidder. Right? What does that mean ultimately? I think it's important for Canada to be at the table in Southeast Asia, to be there regularly, not just for a one-off trip, but to have an enduring presence so that it is part of these subtle conversations and recognizes these opportunities as they arise. Right? That's what I would push Canada to do, and I think that's what a lot of Southeast Asian partners are looking for with Canada as well. Right?
Great, thank you very much. That was very insightful and to the point within time, so well done. Jennifer, you have 4 minutes and you're...
Do I have a question? Okay.
Yes, you do. You get a question. How about this one? You can tell me if you like it. We are witnessing Southeast Asia regional integration at a time of conceptual and geopolitical transition. So how are Southeast Asian nations navigating this flux and responding at a national level, and how is Canada factoring this into its approach to Southeast Asia?
Yeah, I feel like the first part of the question, I would end up repeating a lot of what we've already just said. I can pick up a little bit on Kai's last point, which is actually about where Canada comes into this. Just going back for a second, though, to this concept of whether ASEAN is trapped between China and the United States. I think when you talk to a lot of academics and practitioners, they will tell you that this is an overly simplistic framing because there's a variety of relationships going on for a variety of reasons. And it's also important, I think, diplomatically, strategically, economically, to understand that not everything is a threat, but everything is an opportunity, right? You can do with that what you will. Now, in terms of Canada, I mean, this is a bit of a bee in my bonnet. I feel that Canada really actually has an opportunity at this juncture to enhance its relationship in the region with ASEAN members and ASEAN as a community, perhaps in a way that they were less free to do so, especially during the Cold War and, of course, in the context of the War on Terror and so on. I also have a problem with the Indo-Pacific framing. I think this is something we're all pretty aligned with on this panel for a variety of reasons that have already been mentioned. But one of the problems I have with the Indo-Pacific framing is because it actually puts the Canadian involvement in the region within this frame. And Canada has a lot of different entry points into the region, and the Asia-Pacific is one of them. Asia-Pacific has always included Canada. The idea of, APEC and those trade missions during the Chrétien era, I mean, that was an explicitly Pacific framing of the Canadian relationship with Southeast Asia and East Asia that was separate from, purely looking at the region from a strategic perspective that centered American interests and the rivalry between China and the United States. So Canada, I think, really has an opportunity to engage with the region in more of its middle power, soft power positioning that it used to have. One of my recent pieces, I mentioned that the relationship between Canada and ASEAN has tended to range from general absence to mutual benign neglect. And it would be great if we could change that. And I think there's an opportunity here, primarily, to change that. I don't think I have a lot else to say without saying everything that's already been said. I did also want to say, I don't want to, Russia is also in the mix. We haven't said that at all, I don't think, yet, today or on any of these panels. But, yeah, so Russia's in the mix. So there's definitely countries in the region that are more open to relationships with Russia than they were in the past. And that's also something to not be either paranoid or cavalier about. But, yeah, I think the Americans, I think the Americans need to understand that they continue to be extremely important. They have always been the hub and spoke. It was never China. It's always been the Americans. And that will continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. But it's no wonder that ASEAN and its members are also just pragmatically having conversations with everybody else. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So we will go to Alexander and hope we have a better connection where we can hear you clearly. And the question for you, Alexander, you have 4 minutes for this one, is Vietnam is frequently cited as a leading case of strategic hedging with its bamboo diplomacy, balancing flexibility with firmness. Given Vietnam's changing economic ties with both Washington and Beijing, how do you see Hanoi rethinking elements of this hedging strategy?
Thank you, and let me know if you don't hear me. So yeah, I think Vietnam is hedging and even has a very good metaphor for its approach, which is bamboo diplomacy. And one example is Vietnam elevated its relationship with the United States to a comprehensive strategic partnership in September 2023. And only 3 months after that, in December 2023, Vietnam also elevated in a joint China's community of common destiny, which is translated into English as community with a shared future. And Vietnam was the 8th ASEAN member to join China's community of common destiny. So Vietnam had long resisted in joining China's community until after it elevated its relationship with the U.S. to a very high level of partnership, which is comprehensive strategic partnership. So we see that Vietnam is practicing sort of bamboo diplomacy to a large extent. Now, this bamboo diplomacy allows Vietnam to swing very widely and to lean close to either the U.S. or China or Russia or whoever else, and then swing back. And so with regard to the reciprocal tariffs from the Trump administration, Vietnam was one of the first governments in the world to contact Washington and to offer a negotiation. And Vietnam was also one of the very first few countries that was able to kind of to get a sort of agreement with the Trump administration about the tariffs in July. So now, are the Vietnamese leaders rethinking some elements of their hedging or bamboo strategy? They are, but the more they think, they rethink, they think their strategy, the more they are convinced that hedging and bamboo is the best way for them to respond to the uncertainty and volatility of current international politics. Now, but they are also aware that it's going to be more difficult for them to practice bamboo, to practice hedging. And in this context, I like the term multi-alignment propagated by Jai Shankar, the Foreign Minister of India. So, and in this context, I would use bamboo and hedging and multi-alignment interchangeably. It means that a smaller country would try to lean closer to each of the great powers and align temporarily or sectorally or selectively with all of the great powers that are important in their strategic environment. And so we see Vietnam is, in some aspects closely aligned with the U.S., in some other aspects closely aligned with Russia, with China, and so on and so forth. Now, the reality is that because of the heightened great power competition, multipolarity or hedging or bamboo is going to be very difficult. And so I think for Vietnam, there are different choices. They would not join, they would not balance or bandwagon with any great power, right? But but their multipolarity will have different forms for them to choose, either a shallow multipolarity. Multi-alignment, a shallow multi-alignment, shallow hedging, shallow little bamboo, or deep multi-alignment, deep hedging very wide, very close to some other countries, and so on. But there's a dilemma for Vietnam, and particularly not just for Vietnam, but for many other countries. When you hedge very substantively, when you have a deep multi-alignment, then you have more benefits, but at the same time, you have more risks. When your multi-alignment is shallow, then you have less risk, but at the same time, you have less benefits. For example, Vietnam aspires to become a major hub in the supply chains for high technology. It wants to develop its semiconductor industry. And it's also, and both China and the US are eyeing its reserves in rare earth. But if Vietnam, wants to develop into that kind of critical hub in the supply chain, then it will have to take sides. It can either be in the US camp or in the Chinese camp. It cannot be in both. And so that's the dilemma for the Vietnamese leadership. And I think what they would take would be a mid-range multi-alignment, not very shallow, but not very deep. So again, in the middle range of multi-alignment, trying to preserve their autonomy and their flexibility to be a bamboo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful on just how flexible that bamboo diplomacy can be. I would like to invite each of our panelists to have a closing comment, very brief, about a minute each, and then perhaps we actually will open the floor to questions from the audience who I suspect have some burning desires to pose questions to these panelists. So go ahead. Amitav, you can have the first comment, response to anything the others have said.
I really don't have much to say, except that I want to say there are flyers of my book available if you want to pick it up. Thank you. And the book is here. Thank you.
Kai?
Thanks. I don't have any flyers, unfortunately, or a book to pass on to you. But I'll say, of the many things I can wrap up with, maybe I'll just press to avoid simplistic narratives around Southeast Asia. We heard the region, much of the region doesn't view Southeast Asia, doesn't view China as a threat. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't mean it unconditionally views it as an opportunity either. Almost all the positions are more nuanced and more sectorally dependent. There is a lot of frustration in Southeast Asia with China's actions in the South China Sea, or with its involvement in the Myanmar civil war, which hasn't come up at all today, despite being one of the world's most bloody conflicts, right? We need to keep those nuances in mind with China in the same way that we do with the United States, or else we risk making decisions that I think simply don't reflect and don't align with the realities of our counterparts.
Thank you very much for bringing up 2 points which had not been raised earlier and which do play an important factor in weighing all those important tensions at play within the region. Jennifer?
Thank you. I guess something I can add is something fairly obvious that most people know, but I feel sometimes can get lost with the structure of an event like this, which is, the ASEAN countries and ASEAN as a region, they're not all just waiting around for the US and China to decide what to do next, right? Like, they are their own countries dealing with their own things. And I think putting everything in the frame of Indo-Pacific strategy from this perspective can be very problematic in the sense of just missing a lot of opportunities to see some of that nuance and understand some of those complexities from a scholarly or a practitioner perspective. I think also relatedly, just something we've heard a bit of a theme here and there today, which is that somehow that we're like the rules-based order has collapsed, or that the UN is forever going to be useless, or that institutions don't matter anymore. And I think that's really premature to say. And also, if we say they've collapsed, they've collapsed. If we say they haven't, then they haven't, because that's how norms work and that's how these institutions work. And I still think that in the region, there continues to be a lot of appetite for a rules-based order. For the foreseeable future, it appears as though even some of the scary countries in the region continue to have an appetite for a rules-based order, which doesn't mean that they won't try to bend that order in the direction of what they want. But that has always been the case in the rules-based order, whether we call it liberal or not. So I think it's just important to just always remain clear-eyed about these dynamics and kind of understand the region as autonomous. And even though we are discussing the region in its relationship to the US and to Canada and to China, the region also is a region, and the countries in the region are countries, and they have agency. And we need to do more listening overall, is my general perspective.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that timely reminder about the importance of listening. So, Alexander.
Yes, thank you. We talk about ASEAN, and I think part of the DNA of ASEAN is the preference for regional autonomy. And regional autonomy is stemming also from the preference for national autonomy. Here in this context, I would like to emphasize that we should not underestimate the agency of the countries in Southeast Asia, but at the same time, don't overestimate their agency. The second thing I would like to emphasize is oftentimes we talk about ASEAN centrality as a sort of, the implication as a consequence of ASEAN unity. But I would like to emphasize that ASEAN centrality may still thrive when ASEAN is not in unity. And the third thing is about hedging strategy. I think hedging is not a strategy. It's multiple strategies. And many countries are reacting to the uncertainty and volatility of international relations with hedging, but they are hedging in very, very different ways. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, panelists, for being willing to be browbeaten by your moderator. And we have succeeded in leaving some time for questions from the audience. So now, audience, I sincerely count on you to come up with some brilliant questions for these panelists whose time I have reserved for you. I see 3 questions to start with. I'm going to start with Sean first. I think you have your hand up. And then one behind you. And then one over there for the first round.
Actually,
Things from Jeremy. Jeremy, do you have your hand up? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
can you stand up?
comes out of, is a kind of comment that comes out of everything that came out of the panel. There seems to be a kind of misperception built into the Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy. Centric, strategic focus on the Indo-Pacific.
For that comment in which there was perhaps a question embedded, or there was a third question over here, and then a fourth one, and then I will stop taking the questions for the first round. So go ahead over here.
Thank you. Again, great panel.
Thank you. One fourth question over here, and then we'll let the panelists have their will. So go ahead. Yeah, fourth question over here, please.
Hi, Jeff Mahan. It was established during the panel that ASEAN has done a good job trying to not pick sides and wants to move forward with that. And I think a lot of people have said this is a model to try and emulate. But a few weeks ago, and Kai, you alluded to it, when Trump was in Kuala Lumpur for the ASEAN summit, he signed 2 deals, one with Cambodia and one with Malaysia. And they included some very new precedents in these agreements in the form of economic security provisions, which essentially boil down to the U.S. trying to get them to align on against certain third parties, read China. And the question for me is, has that opened up a new area where they've actually created a path for those to essentially be pushed into picking a side? And then I'll also flag that I've got an op-ed on this very issue out today in Asia, so not a book, but I got to put a plug in.
I think. So, do I have any volunteers for? I'm going to let Jennifer go first, and then I will let.
I want to let the great mind.
No, Jennifer, you go first.
Just really quickly, Sean, your question, who is better at managing ASEAN? I mean, for whom? But if you're asking who tends to be better at ASEAN relations, I think many people would probably argue China. Again, because proximity, more of a focus on those relationships, less of a tendency to be too blunt. They've got a good long game. And it's multi-strategic, right? So that's the short answer, right or wrong from me. Jeremy, I think, I agree with what you said. But you did say that we focused on ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific strategy. I don't actually think we really did. I think it was mentioned as the, strategic linchpin of the whole strategy, but in practice, it wasn't. And I think for a lot of ASEAN scholars, that's why we found the Indo-Pacific strategy a little bit frustrating. But I don't think you're wrong. I think it is kind of like a courtyard, and that's something we need to be better at, frankly, is kind of figuring out those relationships. And then your point about, I don't know anything about Myanmar, really, so I can't speak to that. But your point about, for example, the Malaysian Free Trade Agreement with Trump, that is not without contention and debate in Malaysia as well. And I think perhaps, again, we underestimate the skill of the ASEAN leaders because they're longstanding Southeast Asian politics, there's a lot of talk, so we don't know really how it's all going to play out. And at the time, it was certainly a strategic decision. I don't know what the ratification processes are and what this agreement's actually going to look like. I do understand that some of the provisions that were put in it are quite contentious, but I can't speak to beyond that. Yeah.
Thanks. I'll just, in the interest of time, address only the Myanmar and the tech-related question on Myanmar. This is a conflict that the world needs to pay much, much more attention to, not just because of the terrible humanitarian toll, but also illicit crime and the conflict economy has completely crowded out the legitimate economy in many areas. So Myanmar is now the world's largest producer of opium. The floor estimate on cybercrime from industrial scale compounds in the relatively stateless areas put it at about 50 billion cost per year. That's the floor. That's more than Canada-ASEAN trade in a given year, to put it into context, right? And it could very well be considerably higher than that. I don't want to oversimplify either the role of China in this conflict. China is an enabler of the election coming up and embedding the junta. China has also resisted and cracked down on some of the cyber crimes when its own interests have been pressed. So it is not a black or white position, but there certainly is frustration at some of China's actions there. On the tech question, I think tech is a unique sector in that it's been fairly clear over the last few years that the tech world is bifurcating into a Western US-led model and cluster of companies, and then more Chinese-led cluster of companies. And I think it's been clear that on that dimension, countries have to some extent, make decisions, because there's been a lot of pressure put on them to align with one side over another because of security concerns. What I would say is that I don't think one country in Southeast Asia making a decision to align with the United States or China on tech means that they're more comprehensively aligning, because I think they will do everything they can to compartmentalize tech and chip manufacturing, supply chains related to that from other sectors of the economy, right, to maintain agency in other areas.
Amitav?
You don't want to ask her?
I will ask Alexander. Okay, if you'd like me to go to Alexander first, then why don't you do that? Alexander, I don't know whether you could hear the questions because there was no microphone. Were you able to hear any of the questions?
No, I did not.
Okay, so I will let Amitav answer first, and then I'll see if I can summarize the questions for you, Alexander, and you can have your kick at the can.
All right. So Sean's question, and I know Sean, where is he coming from? And I worked with him 30 years ago, or 25 years ago. Here is one short answer. ASEAN is not a homogeneous, united organization. It's 10, now 11. Started with 5, now 11. There's always division, historically. But ASEAN finds unity, not in diversity, but also in division. And I'm not saying because I like ASEAN, but I've seen this happen repeatedly. And ASEAN's death has been predicted so many times, over. But your second question is more interesting. Is US or China better at managing ASEAN? The answer is very clear. It depends on who is ruling, which country. In the early 2000s, China was better before Xi Jinping building islands and assertiveness. China's 2000 policy was better in managing ASEAN. It got China into the regional forums and kind of more in a benign way. The United States was better under the Democrats, Obama in particular. No matter what these people said in the morning, he, with his Indonesian background, he was extremely popular in Southeast Asia. And he managed ASEAN very well. Biden managed ASEAN very well. Trump is uncomfortable, and at the moment, we don't see good management. So it depends on regimes in Washington and Beijing. And that leads me to one other question, which is the recent Trump visits and the new conditions. You're quite right. He imposed several new conditionalities, compliance with the U.S. Trade regulations that are pretty harsh and were accepted because of pragmatism. But that doesn't mean, and I repeat, that doesn't mean it will be obeyed as expected. ASEAN will find a way to bend it, subvert it, and maintain relations with both U.S. and China.
Thank you very much. So, Alexander, I'm going to try and summarize very briefly some of the questions. You can pick and choose if you want to answer any of them. So one had to do with whether the U.S. or China is better at managing ASEAN. One had to do with the role that China is playing in Myanmar as a proxy and related to organized crime, drug problems, and the Chinese control of watersheds, the impact on Southeast Asia. And another question had to do with ASEAN's ability to manage relations with U.S. and China, and whether the U.S. has opened a new area for engagement with ASEAN. So take your pick.
Okay, so I think very shortly, I think whether China or the U.S. is better at managing ASEAN is still an ongoing struggle between the two struggle. So they of course they want to try to manage, but the verdict is out. It's not out. So we are still. I don't think that there's a verdict here. Sometimes the U.S. was in the past better. Sometimes China was better, but in the future we don't know. In terms of China's relation with Myanmar, I think I agree with Kai. It's not a black and white picture, but the picture is very complex sometimes. But Myanmar is very, 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 very important for China. If you are in China, not in the US, then you can see that Myanmar, can replace to some extent the South China Sea. It provides China with a backdoor to the Bay of Bengal and to kind of break out from China's isolation, geographic isolation, and from the dependency on the Malacca Strait. And so, and also then you also have a lot of rare earth in Myanmar. That's just one aspect of it. And so what China is doing is trying to, to maintain a relationship with both the junta and the opposition. And so that whoever is the ruler in Myanmar, China will have the upper hand. Again, I think Myanmar is, when it comes to the competition between the U.S. and China, then of course China has a very great advantage in Myanmar. With regard to what was the third question?
Thank you very much, Alexander. We have, I think, time for one more question from the floor, and then we're going to have to wrap up this panel because I don't want to keep the ambassadors waiting for their panel. So actually, I'm going to take a question at the back. Yes.
Familiar with the recent pivot around Canada's overseas development assistance program to put more emphasis on the trade development nexus. So I'm just curious if anybody on the panel has a comment around how that shift or that pivot with more emphasis on ensuring that there's some reciprocal trade benefits associated with the overseas development assistance, how that fits in with Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, if at all. And you might want to a little bit on some specifics if you can. Thank you.
I think I'm going to see if any of the panelists want to bite on that one.
Not me. I'm not Canada's Indo-Pacific specialist, so I will not be able to answer that.
Kai, I detect enthusiasm.
I'm not sure it's enthusiasm, nor am I sure that I have a good answer. What I do want to do is express some concern about the reduction in overseas foreign assistance at a time when USAID has, of course, pulled back a lot of funding. It's left a vacuum that there is another big actor in the region who has been very willing and quick to fill. So I think there is a lot of lost opportunity in maintaining relatively low-cost, high-impact connections there. And I do want to say, I think the appetite, again, for Canada is not just as another trading partner, but as another comprehensive partner at the table. And comprehensive means, yes, more trade in commodities, more trade in goods, but also deeper engagement on a lot of other fronts as well.
Thank you, Kai, for bringing us to closure on this panel. I think we've had a very rich and insightful array of views by our panelists who have drawn on their expertise in a very substantial range of areas, given their backgrounds and what they're working on now. And I think that provided us with plenty of food for thought. And I'd like to thank the audience as well for their questions, because I think that enabled a degree of interaction and allows the panelists to understand what brought the audience to this particular event. So thank you very much to our panelists and to the audience.